Welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell. And this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light. Okay, so hi again. Great to be back. I'm joining you today from New York. Alan, we're both in New York, and yet we're in different places. What are we doing?
I don't know. Well, hopefully later we can go grab a beer together.
I'm totally up for that. I've just come in from London, where I've been working with about 300 publishers there on starting to try and understand what this big tech breakup is starting to look like. And so I'm absolutely delighted today that we've got an expert on the line who's going to tell us a little bit about where Europe is at in the various the competition and antitrust actions. And so I'd like to introduce Damien. Can you help me pronounce your surname so I get it exactly right, please?
If you want to say it the French way, it's Girardin. If you want to say it the English way, it's Girardin. Both works.
You see, I believe everything you say now because you have that incredible European accent. Everybody's going to believe that. So where are you? And tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
So today I'm in Brussels, but I tend to commute quite a bit between Brussels and London. By way of introduction, I started my career as a law professor in various universities in Europe and in the United States. And then about 20 years ago, I decided to become a private practitioner, first on a part-time basis, but soon on a full-time basis. And a few years ago, I created my own firm, which is called Girardin Partners, which started in Brussels, but now we've got 5 offices: Brussels, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Helsinki. We have about 50 people, and we are specialized in tech cases, which means that we advise on competition issues, but we also advise clients on tech regulations, DMA, DSA, GDPR, AI. And then we're also involved in litigation, typically against big tech. So we chose our side some years ago. We don't work for big tech. We work for challengers, and if you know my work, you know that already. But I suppose you will also find this out during this interview.
Amazing. Thank you. Oh, by the way, congratulations on picking the right side. That was an excellent piece of
Well, we can talk about it. Some of your listeners may have a different view, but that's fine.
So the interesting thing for me is that I'm a journalist. I'm a lifelong journalist. And so to me, I'm supposed to focus on writing the stories and publishing them. But that just became 15 years ago when big tech was in its extreme rise. That didn't work anymore because no matter how well I did my job, that didn't guarantee anybody saw it at all. And so I felt I needed to understand more about the market we were in and understand competition. And I think I first mentioned antitrust in the boardroom of News Corp in 2004. Yeah, and no one even knew what it was then. And I've been following it really closely ever since. Now we're at a stage, there's a joke in London. You spend a lot of time in London. There's a joke Absolutely. That you wait your entire day waiting for a bus and then 2 arrive at the same time. And Alan and I were joking on this podcast last week that, not only are there 2 antitrust cases happening, they're actually happening in the same courtroom at the same time, okay, in America. And we're seeing the world change. So really, what I'd really like to know from you is where are we at in Europe? And I know Alan's got a million questions about GDPR and about privacy and about the DMA, but where is Europe right now? And what impact does the American action have on the things you're doing?
Yeah, so I think that Europe has always been at the forefront of trying to keep big tech honest, which is also a part of my job. Basically, the first major investigation was against Microsoft about 20 years ago. And then the European Commission looked at Intel. And then the attention, was on Google. and then more recently, Amazon, Meta, and so on, and Apple also. So I think um, really we've got a lot of action at the moment. And I think what has changed during the course of my career, I started looking into this, 30 years ago, basically, where there was not much happening, is that it's not only a sort of antitrust game, but it's also a regulatory game where, because antitrust is a very slow tool, it's an expensive tool. There's a very heavy burden of proof. All decisions are appealed, and so on and so forth. There was a need for regulation that would allow regulators to do things more quickly. And this is what happened with the DMA. So now basically, we're looking at these cases from several angles, not only antitrust, which remains a very powerful tool, but also the DMA. And so, yes, there are lots of different cases. Another thing which has happened in the course of my career is that initially the European Commission was the only game in town, right? But over time, national regulators, especially in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, have become more powerful. And so we've got a lot of action in these different jurisdictions. So I think basically the field has expanded to through new legal instruments, but also geographically, because there has been an effort to decentralize antitrust. And now you've got some very powerful regulators which have resources that are almost as big as the European Commission looking into these cases. And these cases are attractive for regulators because they're high profile, right? Much more so than cases that deal with some heavy industries or food or travel. Everybody wants to have a big tech case these days.
Can I just ask a question before I let Alan in? So I'm fascinated by that, but I wonder what drives that momentum. Do you think that the politicians and the regulators are feeling a change in the mindset of people, of the public? Are people changing their mind? Or is this just a point in time opportunity to take back some power?
I think it's a combination of different things. I mean, first of all, I think that the vision of people of big tech has changed over time. And, the CEO of a large news publishers told me one day that, 10 years ago, everybody wanted, all journalists wanted to have some money to go to the Silicon Valley and go to Google and Apple to tell the good news, right? New products, growth, and so on and so forth. Now, they still want to go to the Silicon Valley, but to look at the last scandal, right? And I think that for a long time, Google, Amazon, Meta had extremely good press, and that changed in the last few years. Even Apple, which was the darling, right, of the media, and people loved Apple. Things are changing as well. They're having major trouble, and I think that has started a shift. And of course, competition authorities and politicians, they follow these shifts, right? And I think also that some have been shocked by the massive amount of money that are generated by these companies, which don't pay any taxes. At least in Europe, they're all based in Ireland, where they have cheap tax deals, right? And then I think there's a feeling of unfairness. Finally, I think these companies, have been very aggressive, and they have mistreated some of their business users, right? And there are a lot of companies relying on the goodwill of Amazon or Apple or Meta or Google, and they're upset. And so to have competition cases, you need to have complainants, right? And so you've got lots of companies going to the European Commission or the Bundeskartellamt in Germany or the CMA in the UK saying, look, you have to help me because I'm basically crushed by these companies. So I think it's a combination of public perception, government perception, and then some complainants, which can be sometimes very large companies. I mean, if you look, for example, at the App Store, the Play Store, you've got companies like Epic Games or Spotify or Match Group that have been very aggressive. Third-party sellers are not particularly happy with Amazon these days. And these guys visit competition authorities and try to get, these authorities to step in. This is basically what has happened.
That's a wonderful 10,000-foot view. So I really appreciate that. I want to dig in a little bit more, and maybe we start with the EU DMA. I mean, what was that law trying to address? What specific thing is it? And was it comparable to what companies were trying to deal with in terms of the telcos back in the 70s and 80s, kind of the network effect, or is it bigger than that?
I think, it all started 7 or 8 years ago with a sort of project in the UK. The government created a commission, which was called the Furman Commission. It's Jason Furman, which is from Harvard, which had been invited by the government to look into this. And the report of the Furman Commission was to say, look, there are significant problems. And the only tool we have is antitrust. But antitrust is not necessarily the right tool because these investigations last for a very long time. And by the time you have a decision, the market has tipped. So it always comes too late. And it's true that if you look into these investigations very often, they take 5, 6, 7, or 8 years. And by the time you have a decision, it doesn't matter anymore because the market has tipped. So they thought, okay, we need something that is faster. How can we do this? Well, we can do this through regulation because then we will just simplify things. So if you look at the DMA, unlike in antitrust, you don't need to define markets. You don't need to show effects. You just need to show that a given provision of the DMA has been breached, right? So basically, these are per se obligations, unlike antitrust, where it's all about the effects, and you can argue forever about the effects. Are the effects large enough, too small, whatever? So that I think that was the sort of intellectual impetus for the DMA. Let's do things in a simpler way. Antitrust has become too slow, too expensive, and so on. Now, I think at the same time, what really struck me during the DMA, because I sort of, assisted some clients to get the DMA adopted, is that governments were extremely keen. Typically when you have a commission proposal, because, in the EU legislative system, it's the European Commission that makes proposal. The proposal is always very ambitious. And then the member states and the parliament, which are co-legislators with the European Commission, will sort of water it down. And here, it's the opposite that happened. The French government, they wanted more. The German government, they wanted more. And I think it's because, there was this sense in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in other countries that these companies had become too powerful, right? And there were a lot of German companies, French companies, or even American companies banging on their door saying, we need to do something about it, right? These companies are way too big. They make way too much money and we're crushed. And basically, the combination of this sort of finding that antitrust was too slow with a very strong political demand for action led to the adoption of the DMA. Now, what is the DMA trying to do? Well, the two objectives are, and it's like coded language, to create more contestability and fairness. What does it mean? Contestability means create more competition, right? So, for example, if you look at, the iOS ecosystem and the Android ecosystem, until the DMA, there was only one app store, basically. Well, technically on Android, you could have other ones, but basically these guys were monopolists. The App Store and the Play Store were monopolists, right? And why was it the case? Well, on iOS, there could only be one app store. They were not allowing, direct downloading of apps from the internet, unlike what you can do even with a MacBook, right? And so you have provisions in the law that make that possible, right? You can also, app developers should be able to choose their own payment solution instead of using the one that is imposed by Apple or Google. So that's more competition. And the other one is more fairness. By, for example, if you look at the App Store fees, an obligation for these fees to be, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And that's true not only for app stores, but it's true for all the sort of, other products or services from gatekeepers. So these were the objectives: more competition and more fairness.
Yeah. So I guess my follow-up to that is, how effective has the DMA been thus far? Like, what's your report card on progress at this point, and where have they succeeded and where have they failed? And then I've got a couple of follow-ups from there.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And look, it's a question that I'm asked every day. Is it a success or failure? And I think the jury is still out. So I think there is a certain degree of disappointment because a lot of provisions of the DMA are not yet fully implemented, right? I mean, gatekeepers had until March of last year to implement the DMA, and many provisions were not implemented, right? I mean, for example, a company like Apple just did not implement the DMA at all, right? They just ignored it and took a very aggressive approach. So some clients said, well, we spend a lot of money and a lot of time and resources trying to push for the DMA, and we don't see a difference. So that's negative. Now, there's also a positive in that some gatekeepers played by the book, and you have indeed some provisions that have been implemented at a satisfactory level. And then the provisions that have not been implemented led, not in all cases, but in some cases, to enforcement actions, right? And already you have a couple of decisions that came out, one against Apple and one against Meta. And they came with, we haven't seen the decisions yet because they're not published. We just saw the press release. And they came with fines, 400 million in the case of Apple, 200 million in the case of Meta. And I think it's going to be difficult for these companies to escape, right? Because if you do not comply with the decision, then you can be subject to periodic penalty payments like 5 million a day until such time you comply. And then if you fail to comply, not once, but twice, 3 times, then the sanctions become, more serious. So this idea that they can escape forever, I think, is a false one. And I think that some companies will see at some point that they have to do something about compliance. So if you ask me today whether the DMA made a difference, I would say a moderate yes. But I think that in a couple of years' time, it will be probably a yes, because I don't think the European Commission will back down. Also, it's important to know that the DMA is it's a regulation, so it has so-called direct effect. What does it mean? It means that you can sue gatekeepers in court to force them to implement the DMA. At the moment, we haven't seen much litigation because I think that business users, which are the main beneficiaries of these provisions, are still waiting to see what the Commission will do. But if the Commission doesn't take action, I think they will go to court. I know some companies that told me, well, we're waiting a little bit more. And, if nothing happens, we're just going to court. So, it's the dynamics are actually quite interesting. It's never perfect. And of course, you have problems, asymmetry of resources. The commission has limited resources, whereas these companies have endless resources. They will, of course, appeal, although appeals don't have suspensive effect, but, they tie up a lot of resources. I think where they failed, by the way, I think although they have lots of lobbyists, they completely failed in the court of public opinion. And it's really funny because and you know why they failed? I think they failed because they decided to be in full opposition of regulatory efforts. At their place, I think I would have been a little bit more nuanced. In these sort of battles, you have to make concessions to focus on the key points. But if you say no to everything, you lose on everything. And, what I've been told by people close to the industry is that some of these companies are highly centralized. And, there might be some people in the Silicon Valley that just say, European regulators are completely stupid. They don't know what we're doing. And, screw them, basically. But that's not really productive. So it's very tough for their people on the ground, based in Brussels, based in London, or based in Paris, because sometimes they receive some, very negative instructions from their bosses in the US. And I think it's been their major failure. I think they failed in, on the legislative side, because they got a DMA that is probably worse than their worst nightmare. And they're failing on the implementation side because they keep losing, right? But
I think that
I'm not complaining about that.
They've adopted a bit of a 2015 mindset, which in 2025 just isn't working. And so you get the sense that particularly Apple has overplayed their hand here.
Totally. It's amazing. It's amazing how they screw up. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now, of course, their main audience are their users. I mean, people, even in my own family, although, I've filed complaints against Apple. My wife and daughters, they still love their devices, and they will buy the new one. And so I think they still have very strong following from their users, but you cannot ignore regulators. And you cannot ignore courts. For example, you saw that they've been found in contempt of court recently. That's a serious matter, right? I mean, I feel as a company you should avoid that. One thing that has always struck me is that the board is not doing anything about it, right? I mean, but it's because the money keeps flowing. And we know that American boards tend to be weak boards because it's the friends of the friends, right? But at some point, there may be someone in one of these companies that will say enough is enough, right? I mean, to be found in contempt of court is pretty serious.
Damien, can I just jump in? So to maintain the European theme, I'd like to say that the troubles of the big tech media means that I want to take out the world's smallest Stradivarius violin. I really have no sympathy at all for their position because it's been based on deep arrogance, and you've just hit on two things that don't get talked about enough. So the likelihood of eventually this free run ending wasn't a likelihood, it was an inevitability, and anybody that runs a board should know that. Their job is to show a fiduciary responsible outlook for their shareholders, and that's to also recognize that the band can't play forever. I think that they're going to be judged very harshly in time for having decided to do nothing. Equally though, these are people that have generally operated in a bubble. They believe that the valley, somebody actually from Google actually said to me, Ricky, what you have to appreciate is that we are the evolution of humanity. We are a evolutionary step for human thinking. That was what they told me. Okay. But it doesn't absolve them of responsibility under competition law. And so now they're bashing into the law. They're crashing into the rock that is the law all over the world and finding that that's immovable and impervious to their charms and their behaviors. Do you think, where do you think this ends? If you were to grab your, grab your crystal ball, how fast does this actually meaningfully change? Is it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I think that there are different forces at play. I think regulators, competition authorities, sector-specific regulators can certainly achieve a number of things, right? Because there's a growing resolve from, governments. They want to do things. But let's face it still takes a lot of time. And you have this asymmetry of resources, which means that, if I look around in Brussels, I think, if you look at the top firms, they're all captured by big tech, right? I mean, all the leading law firms. And then you've got a few people like me in smaller firms that are fighting for the rest of the market, right? So it's a very unequal fight. So I think that means that there are limitations to what can be achieved because the legal process gives an advantage to those who have resources, right? Now, what can make a big difference are market shifts. You've seen that Google's stock dropped 2% when an Apple executive said, we might be looking into, AI and, we may do our own stuff. And I mean, suddenly, and look, this could be a big shift. That started with the DOJ going after Google and winning their case, right? In search and basically saying, well, this agreement, this $20 billion a year agreement with Apple is illegal, right? And that may actually shift the market because then if this agreement's not possible, Apple will want to develop their own search products, right? Because they will just not, if they stop receiving the 20 billion, I think they will want to make the money through their own products. So that means that sometimes regulators may create market shifts, and this is a good example of one. But I think there will be broader market shift, right? Will search still be search? Or, will people increasingly use ChatGPT 4 or Grok or Gemini? Nobody knows. I'm a big user of AI these days because I think it's useful, right? And you can do more things. And I think I still believe that the main impact will be through market shifts, whether they're triggered by regulators or triggered by new technologies. So if you ask me 3 to 5 years or 2 to 4 years, I mean, I can see investigations having impacts, but what I don't know is what will be triggered by innovation, which is still the main risk for these guys, right? And some of these companies are very narrow. Look at Google and look at Meta. 90+% of their revenues are generated by ads, right? And essentially by a limited number of products and services. Microsoft is in a different position. Amazon is a different position. To some extent, Apple is in a different position. So their degree of vulnerability is also different.
Agree with every single word of that. And thank you for explaining it so simply. I'm not a lawyer, but what I do recognize is that when regulations and antitrust things like this happen, okay, it spawns competition. It gives everybody a belief that it's worth fighting again because there might be something to win. In a monopolistic market, you have zero chance of winning. In a chaotic market that's in change, you have some chance of winning. And that's really what we're trying to create, is to crack open an opportunity. And I can tell you right now, having just spent, the last 2 weeks traveling and talking to publishers all over the world, they are incredibly enthused for the first time in 15 years to get out and give something else a go. And I don't mean let's just go and sign a deal with someone so we can keep going for another year, which has been the attitude for the last 20 years, 15 years. Okay. It's actually, let's build something. Let's actually take them on. Oh, by the way, have you written that investigation into Google yet? It's a very, very changed market. So it may not feel like much is happening, but there's an awful lot of change happening in the undercurrents. Okay.
I think that's right. And look, I've been advising news publishers for a long time. And it's true that 5 years ago, the mood was very pessimistic, right? Because their business was sort of disappearing, right? And for many of them, it's still disappearing. We've not hit the bottom yet, right? But at the same time, I think they see progress. And look, I mean, the decisions by the US courts have really emboldened them, because so far it was always a European matter, right? I mean, it was always a decision of the European Commission coming too late, with the US saying, oh, these Europeans are complete bonkers. They don't know what they're doing. But now, against Google, we have 2 decisions from federal courts, and they're brutal. The search decision is brutal. The AdTech decision is brutal. And I think this will create a domino effect, because I think, because of in particular, the Trump administration, I think that the European Commission, for example, on AdTech, has been waiting to adopt their decision. But now, I don't think they will wait any longer. Right? They may still wait a little bit longer to see which kind of remedies will be implemented in the US. But I think that now they feel more secure to go after big tech. That's one of the interesting things with the Trump administration, is that, you would have thought, especially, if you looked at Inauguration Day, that this would be a paradise for big tech. Not at all. It's been a nightmare for big tech, right? I mean, if you look at Meta, they were really hoping that the case against them would be dropped. Not at all. It's not dropped. Google, I don't think the DOJ is any kinder with them than under Biden. The opposite. Right? I mean, if you look at the head of the DOJ, the head of the FTC, I saw them in Washington a couple of months ago. They speak the same language as the European Commission. Of course, there's a bit of an ideological ban on free speech and these sort of things. But when it comes to hardcore antitrust, they don't see the world differently. And that's a shift. And I think it's giving hopes to publishers.
So what's your sense? You've got regulatory issues going on all around the world. You've got Australia, you've got Japan, you've got the European Union, UK, US. How much do you think different regulators are communicating right now? And is there any thought of like coordinated settlements, or is that just completely crazy town?
No, I mean, look, it's always difficult to tell because this is never public. But I do understand that regulators talk to each other. And they're looking what others are doing. So I think that what may eventually force big tech to change their behavior, and I'm not putting all big tech on the same, I think that some are doing more than others. Like Microsoft, I think is generally a good player. I think they're much smarter in terms of what they do with regulators. Apple is the other extreme. I think they're not doing terribly bad. They're just nefarious, right? And then you've got everything in between, right? So I'm not putting all of them in the same basket, but I think that at the end of the day, they will have to change through a combination of 2 things. First of all, it's a broad fight. As you say, United States, Europe, Australia, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa. I mean, and it's like and I think it's simply because regulators get excited about these issues, right? And also, some of the complainants are extremely well funded, and they visit these regulators. They go to India, they go to South Africa, and so it's getting harder to manage, right? I mean, just think about the sort of distraction of all these investigations, right? And in some cases, the senior executives have to testify, and it takes a lot of bandwidth, basically. So multiple regulatory actions make things difficult. But there's also a lot of litigation. Right now, these companies are facing litigation, all over the world. And it's getting really tricky. So what I think may happen, and it happened with Microsoft 20 years ago. You remember 20 years ago, Microsoft was really the company experiencing difficulties, is that there will be a grown-up in the room saying enough is enough. We need to change our ways and clean up the mess. I think this is what Brad Smith did at Microsoft very successfully. Doesn't mean that they don't have any challenges, but I think they're doing fine, right? And it didn't make them less profitable, right? I mean, what they decided to do was to diversify away from Windows. I mean, Windows is still very profitable, but they're doing all sorts of things. So I suspect that there will be a point where it will be untenable. And I think, and simply because it's just too much. I mean, okay, you may, it's okay to spend $1 billion in legal fees if your turnover is like several $100 billion. But you have only one CEO, you have only one general counsel, and there might become a point where it's just unmanageable. And we're not too far away from that point, I believe. Could be wrong.
I think you're entirely right. So Google generates $1 billion in revenue a day. So let's be clear, a fine is never actually going to change it. But you make a really interesting point. It does ultimately end up that somebody in the business has to smell the coffee. And Brad Smith definitely did it. And he helped his company, Bill Gates and others, recognize that. And we actually had somebody on last week that was a lawyer that was involved in the mix of that. And so I've already read Brad's book. I've read his, six tiers of antitrust grief. I'm very much aware of that. What's interesting here, though, is that at Meta, you have one Caesar that runs the business, that makes every decision, and very weak leadership below him. And so no one wants to compete with him. So what he says goes. And if he wants to go down with the ship, there's a chance that might happen. Okay. And if you look at Google, you've got a CEO who's come from management consulting, whose job it is to look out for shareholders and not pay any attention to the product or to the law. So he's doing exactly what he's paid to do, but he might be the wrong CEO for this era. So we might well see a change in leadership. If you look at Apple, Apple's got a different problem. Apple's wedded to China, that it's having to leave China very quickly. The CEO is not a regulatory CEO. He is a management of supply routes CEO, who again might be the wrong CEO for this era. So we might be about to see some really significant change if the outcome here is to retain shareholder value, which ultimately I think it probably is. So I find it an absolutely fascinating period. Sorry, Alan, I might have stepped in.
No, not at all. I'm agreeing with you here. I think what's really fascinating for me is that it was only a couple of years ago where Apple was completely unassailable. And as a result, did literally whatever in the world that they wanted to do. And we haven't touched on this enough, Damien. There's two separate cases in Europe against Apple with respect to their ATT process. And it was this, ATT was this mechanism that Apple essentially used to push out a fair amount of the third-party advertising companies outside of its iOS ecosystem at the very same time Apple was building their own internal ads product. And what's interesting is now it's been a couple of years, but there's now a recognition that those types of behaviors are impolite, if not entirely illegal. I would love your take on that, Damien.
Yeah, it's interesting because I filed the complaint to the French Competition Authority, which led to their decision on ATT, right? I mean, what struck me in that case was the double language of Apple, which was kind of saying we all do this for privacy and we care about privacy. Privacy is on our DNA. Whereas actually they were applying stricter rules to rivals than to themselves, right? And this sort of pop-up that user were seeing when they were basically owning a new iPhone was not
Some
even
of us call that a
compliant.
scare screen. Sorry to interrupt.
Screen was not even compliant with the GDPR. Publishers had, or app developers had to take additional measures to comply with the GDPR. So that was literally a farce. And yeah, it's. I think the difficulty for Apple is I see it. There's a good book that was written a few years ago, which was called After Steve, and Steve Jobs was, obviously an amazing CEO, right? And he had this incredible ability to come up with new products that nobody had even thought about: the smartphone, the iPod, and the tablets, and so on and so forth. But that genius is gone. So now I think for Apple, you need new revenue streams, and the new revenue streams are services, right? So you're trying to milk your user base. And you're nothing special. An app store is nothing special, for example. Most of their services are nothing special. Is Apple Music better than Spotify? No, it isn't, right? And so I think that because they lost, just speaking about Apple, this sort of incredible genius that powered the company for 20 years, forced them into, more dangerous territories. And I think their efforts to milk the user base has been and might be their demise at the end of the day, because it made a lot of people unhappy.
Well, 100%. And one of the challenges for Apple, just on the privacy realm, is that they have completely lost any semblance of the moral high ground, because two statements cannot both be true. Google is the worst company in the world for privacy. Apple has said that repeatedly. And then the second statement is, but we're going to send all of our users to Google for monetization and still call ourselves a privacy protective community or company. And they've sort of lost that. And I think that we're starting to see regulators get wind that this whole thing has been a bit of a canard.
I totally agree with you. And look, it's a bit sad if you think about it. And I think it's because it's all money driven. I don't think any of the CEOs of these companies are sort of trying to be decent at this point, right? I think they're just trying to please shareholders. Now, I'm not a CEO of a big company, and I cannot promise I would act differently at their place, right? I'm not. It's never personal, right? I'm sure that a lot of very nice and friendly people work in these companies. There might be wonderful people at Google and Apple and everything, but the leadership is really focused on generating, profit. And you could say, well, this is what companies do, right? This is this debate about, shareholder value, and it's, Milton Friedman, it should be the only priority of a company. But I think many people see the world a little bit differently now. And so indeed, I think Apple, which was this amazing company everybody loved, has become, unfortunately, sadly, to some point, a company that has lost its moral high ground and moral compass. I think Google, to some extent as well, right? When Google sort of came up with search, everybody was absolutely amazed. What a wonderful product, right? And you see these young guys, very smart, and when you look at what they said in their initial statements, that search should always be completely objective because you would destroy the tool. Initially, they didn't want any ads. All of that went away because of the focus on shareholders. So it's a bit tragic in a way. And I really hope that, I hope, but I'm naive to some extent, right? I hope there will be a shift at some point, but we'll see.
I'm on a call with two far smarter than me lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer. But one thing that I do know is that if your company's sole objective is to make money, ultimately the product has to suffer. and ultimately competition has to suffer. And that's why antitrust exists on the statute, is to break the chain when the chain becomes so self-perpetuating that it kills all opportunity around it. Okay, that's a very basic human version of antitrust law, please forgive me. But we probably reached that point 5 or 6 years ago, but the amount of money flowing off these companies was so great for the GDP of the nations in which they operated, for the shareholders that owned them, for the people that were being empowered, the political benefit of having the exceptionalism sitting in America. All of these things meant that kind of people decided to put antitrust on the back burner for now, even though the rules of when it should have been enacted probably existed at that point, and they didn't take the moment. And so when it did happen, it's been a real shock for everybody because it's come so late, which makes it harder to unravel. I'm actually thrilled that it's been unraveled as fast and as efficiently as it has, because I thought it was going to be far tougher than this. Damien, is that about right?
Yeah, there's an incredible shift. I mean, look, I before creating my business, I worked for several large US law firms, and we were basically on the defense side. Right. And if you're on the defense side, you think that regulators are stupid, essentially, and that whatever they do is an abuse of power and things like that. And I had my own conversion 10 years ago. And then, you start looking at the world differently. You see, is it normal that these guys do that? No, it's not normal. Right. And what is really refreshing is to see the US administration pivoting at some point, where in the US nothing happened for 20 years, literally nothing, zero, right? These guys had a free ride. And even their best time was the Obama administration, where Obama did nothing except basically empowering them. And then you see the Trump administration. You think, oh, they should love big business. Not at all. I mean, these guys are going strong. And I think is because, they realize that there is also a demand from corporation and consumers to do something about it, right? And so that, I think that's refreshing. Now, should antitrust try to go after everything? Absolutely not. Should we abandon common sense, economic principles? Absolutely not, right? We want good cases, we want strong cases, but it's important to have these cases. So, I've never been an extremist. I'm against, people who want to basically go under any pretext against these companies. But I think it's refreshing to see that you've got government all across the world looking into the matter and pursuing cases when they think they have good cases.
So just want to follow up on the Obama years. I think there's really two components there. First, clearly, regulators during the Obama years missed their moment. They dropped the ball. I don't think you can even debate that. But the second thing that happened, and Google was sort of brilliant about this, is that they were smart enough to wet enough beaks just within the industry so as to dampen some of the complaints against them historically. And so it's actually still considered impolite to openly criticize Google in an industry standards room. I've been in a bunch of them. And whenever I start criticizing Google, everybody starts looking at their shoes, in part because most people either want to eventually work at Google or their companies have millions and millions of dollars riding on the relationship with Google and are therefore much less likely to be critical. And so I don't want to let the Obama folks entirely off the hook, but there is a secondary thing which I don't think gets talked about enough. That Google
no, absolutely. I mean, it's power and influence, and in fact, it's why the DMA has been, I think, an important tool. Is that it's very rare to find a company that is publicly willing to speak against Google or Apple or Amazon. Right? They're all terrified, in fact, because if you're an app developer, you can be kicked out of the App Store, and then you're game over. Right? If you're an Amazon seller, you can be kicked out of Amazon. And then what do you do then? Right? And so on and so forth. So yes, there is fear. And that's why I think antitrust is important, because you will try to create more competition and reduce the power of these companies, which I think is healthy in the long run. Also, I think that it's very interesting if you look at companies like Meta and Google, most of their products have been acquired, right? So this idea that these companies are incredibly innovative, like the world would go back to to the Stone Age, but for these companies, actually wrong. It's the same with big pharma in a way, right? I mean, the bigger the company, it's harder to invest and innovate, because there's always the fear that you will cannibalize your own revenues, right? So if you sit on a super profitable search engine, you really want to push an alternative product? Maybe not, right? So I think it's healthy to have more competition, not only because it may lead to lower prices, these companies will have less power, but also because it will trigger innovation. If you speak to software engineers or life science scientists and you tell them, these big companies are innovative, they will say, yeah, maybe to some extent, but innovation very often starts in smaller outfits where people are free. They have no fear to cannibalize an existing product because there's no existing product, and so on and so forth. So I think competition is really healthy in terms of innovation.
So Damien, I was on stage recently. And somebody asked me, aren't you worried if these big tech companies get broken up? This is going to be a disaster. And I said, you have to be a little bit careful about believing the mystique and the jazz hands that sits behind these. Everybody says that Google's the best search engine, but in honesty, it's the only search engine we've seen for 15 years. So how do we know that that's true? And so somebody said to me, well, where do you think Google ends up? And I said, well, I think Google it's IBM in waiting. And there was silence in the room for a moment. And I said, it will continue to make loads of money, but no one's going to wake up tomorrow and say, I want to work at Google anymore.
I think, look, if you look at the 20th century and the beginning of the 20th century, it's obvious. I mean, companies always go down at some point. It's IBM, General Electric, and I'm sure you can find many others, right? Kodak. And it can be a combination of complacency, regulatory intervention, lack of focus on new products, and so on and so forth. So obviously, all companies are IBMs in the waiting at some point, right? And as to what is really interesting when you speak about breakups is that, nobody would have thought 3 years ago that the DOJ would look for structural remedies, right? Or that the European Commission would even think about this. But now they're really thinking about it. And remedies, it's all that matters in antitrust, right? The fine doesn't matter. The fine is like pocket change, right? Not for all companies, but for big tech. These are small amounts in the grand scheme of things. But remedies, that's what they fear, because that is a game changer. And I believe that in search and in ad tech, there will be structural remedies. I'm pretty certain.
Damien, you're doing amazing work, and we know that you need to go and get on one of these cases right now. So we're going to need to let you go. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, because that's the right thing for society. On my behalf, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for having me and the excellent conversation.
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.